Hey everybody, this is Rykard here again, and welcome to a new video series that I'm going to be starting. Now, as I've been doing Pokemon sets for a very long time, a lot of people have asked me, Rykard, where do you come up with your EV spreads and how do you make them? And normally I just respond with, well, I just have a lot of experience and I just kind of get how things work over time. But to some people, that's not really as good of an explanation as they would have liked. So actually on my Twitter recently, someone mentioned something along the lines of, hey, why don't you do a video series about you explaining how you do all these EV spreads. And so there are a few things I want to talk about in this video series, but this first part that I'm going to be talking about is possibly one of the most important things that I have discovered in my 3 or 4 years of playing competitive Pokemon, which is referring to surpassing speed tiers. So before we get into that, the first thing that we're going to have to obviously understand is what exactly a speed tier is. So to me, a speed tier refers to a base speed stat that is common within a large group of Pokemon. So for example, all Pokemon with a base 100 speed stat fall into the base 100 speed tier. So this would be Pokemon such as Salamence, Typhlosion, Flygon, Charizard, Celebi, Jirachi, etc. All those Pokemon have a base 100 speed stat and fall within the base 100 speed tier. Now when I also say base speed stat, I'm referring to the number with which the number you see in-game is drawn from. So for example, if you are using a Salamence with max speed EVs and a plus speed nature, at level 100 in-game it will read that it has 328 speed, but that 328 speed is just the number that is drawn from its base 100 speed stat. And typically, at least in my mind, speed tiers exist between around 30 base speed to about 130 base speed, and go in increments of 5. So for example, you'd have 30, 35, 40, 45, etc. Now obviously there are Pokemon that have speed that are within this range that aren't a multiple of 5. So for example, Rotom has a speed of 91, for example, if you're using the regular form. So obviously that isn't a multiple of 5, but typically the large majority of Pokemon fall within a multiple of 5 between 30 and 130. And also obviously there are Pokemon on the extremes, whereas a Pokemon like Shuckle is ridiculously slower than base 30, and a Pokemon such as Electrode has a base speed stat that is higher than 130. So there are extremes to this, but if you wanted to categorize them, you would say between 30 and 130 and in increments of 5, at least in my opinion. And if you want to know more information about all this and where I found all this information, there are 3 really good places to check this out. You can find it on Smogon, Cerebi, and Bulbapedia, which will all tell you base speed stats of pretty much whatever Pokemon you want to know about. So at this point, I know what a lot of you are probably thinking as you're watching this and listening to me. You're probably thinking, okay, I now know what a speed tier is, but how does this help me? If I'm running a max speed and positive speed nature on my Pokemon, it isn't like I can make them any faster unless I give them an item like a Choice Scarf. And with that, I'll say, you're absolutely right. Salamence will never get faster than 328 speed, because that is just as high as its speed stat will ever go at level 100. So you might be wondering, well, what do I mean by surpassing speed tiers? If these Pokemon can't be any faster, Salamence is never going to surpass a Pokemon with base 101 speed, so what am I even talking about? Well, as you'll read right here, fast and powerful attackers are not the only Pokemon that benefit from having speed EVs. Most defensive walls and bulky attackers, such as Pokemon that like to run max HP and, max attack, can and should run speed EVs to allow them to outspeed Pokemon they normally quote-unquote shouldn't and gain a distinct advantage over many opponents in battle. And what I mean by shouldn't is your opponents probably won't expect you to outspeed certain things because the game has pretty much been pigeonholed into believing that there is a such thing as standard sets. And I think that is honestly bullcrap. There shouldn't be a such thing as a standard set because everyone should be trying to beat everyone else. So if you're using a standard set, then you're just using the same thing that someone else is using, meaning that you have no shot at beating them with the same Pokemon because you have the exact same one. So if you are running more speed EVs than they are, you will never speed tie with them and you will always outspeed, giving you a distinct advantage in battle. And personally, I think that is possibly the most important thing I could ever tell anybody that is trying to get into competitive Pokemon. Yes, there are good ways to run certain Pokemon, such as, using an offensive Pokemon that's a bulky attacker. You want to have those HP EVs, you want to have those attack EVs, but still, if you're only putting all of your EVs into those two stats, you're really not getting as much out of the Pokemon as I believe you actually can, because you could definitely invest in speed, allowing that Pokemon to outspeed something, as I say, that it shouldn't, and gain a distinct advantage in battle. So within the next couple slides, I'll pretty much be telling you how to do that. So in order to begin this discussion on how we're going to be investing into the speed stat, we first need to understand where we're coming from. So a standard defensive wall or bulky attacker, if you believe that there is a such thing as a standard wall or bulky attacker, usually invests 252 EVs into HP, 252 EVs into one defense or attack stat, and the remainder 4 EVs into a stat of their choosing with a plus attack or plus defense nature. Now I know there are 2 more EVs, but those don't actually do anything, so do not argue with me on that. There will be 2 left over, you can put them anywhere, they don't actually affect anything. But because we're using up all EVs, we need to pull some of the EVs from one of these stats in order to invest in the speed stat. And it's important to try and, figure out where those EVs are going to come from. So I'm going to be giving you 2 examples in this. The first one's going to be our defensive option, which is our Vaporeon, and the second one will be our offensive option, which is our Machamp. So our Vaporeon will be physically defensive, so we'll put 252 EVs in HP, 252 into defense, and 4 into special defense, just to give it 1 more point of bulk in the special defense side. And it is important to note that Vaporeon falls within the base 65 speed tier. And then for our offensive option, we're going to be using Machamp, which has 252 HP EVs, 252 attack EVs, and 4 speed EVs. And then it is also important to note that this Pokemon has a base 55 speed stat, meaning it falls in the 55 speed tier. Now, as I said before, because we're using up all the EVs, we have to figure out where we're going to take EVs from in order to invest into speed. So since defense EVs actually account for more bulk into one defense stat than HP does, and because we want our attackers to hit as hard as they can, there's no reason to take away EVs from our attack stats because that will just make Machamp weaker. We will almost always take EVs out of the HP stat in order to increase our speed. And I know some of you might be thinking I'm crazy for saying this because, especially with the Vaporeon example, why would I get rid of some of its bulk? Because I want Vaporeon to be as defensive as possible. Why would I not put 252 EVs into its HP stat so that it can take physical hits as well as it possibly can? Well, I'm here to actually tell you that that isn't actually as significant as you think it might be. So just to kind of give us a place to go now, at level 100, it takes 48 EVs to comfortably outspeed a Pokemon 1 speed tier above its base speed. And since we're going in increments of 5, I'm referring to Pokemon with 5 more base speed. And also it is important to note that at level 50, it actually takes 52 EVs to comfortably outspeed a Pokemon in a speed tier above where that Pokemon is. And it is important to note this because EVs are slightly different at level 50, and obviously at level 50 I'm referring to mainly battles over Pokemon X and Y Wi-Fi, whereas level 100 is usually done on like a simulator or something like that. But the reason why I'm saying 48 speed EVs will comfortably allow you to is because if you look at the Machamp, or if you remember the Machamp example from before, I decided to put those last 4 EVs into speed. And a lot of people do this because they think that means that they're going to be outspeeding Pokemon that are of the same speed tier as them. But in all honesty, because everybody does this, you're not gaining anything like that. You're just tying with everyone, so it makes it so that you aren't slower. That's pretty much all it does. What I'm saying is with 48 speed EVs, you're actually outspeeding Pokemon by 1 more point than they typically would put in. So if you're taking a look at that Machamp example with 4 speed EVs, Machamp would actually need 8 speed EVs if a Pokemon of base 50 was running 48 speed EVs for Machamp to speed tie it, because the 48 puts it 1 more point above where Machamp is at base 55. So that is important to note and just keep in mind throughout this. And I know that might sound really confusing, but it's basically just EVing yourself to be slightly faster than your opponent so that you will always outspeed it, because speed is the only stat in the game where really every single point matters. Now, for those of you that were wondering before, well, you're taking EVs out of HP, and that's really going to hurt Vaporeon. Well, if you really think about it, since 4 EVs is equal to 1 point of HP at level 100, you are really only losing out on 12 HP. And honestly, that is practically nothing. More often than not, those 12 HP EVs are not going to matter. Yes, I know people have, very low HP survivals. It happens. I have that happen to me too. But more often than not, those 12 HP EVs are going to be completely worthless to you, and they are better off being invested into your speed stat. And at level 50, this is actually roughly 7 HP, so that's even less. It seems a lot less at that stat. But the important thing to know is that since there are those 4 leftover EVs, like I said before, which we put into special defense in the Vaporeon and speed on the Machamp, we actually only need to take out 44 or 48 EVs depending on your level, which is basically going to save you 1 point in HP, which is really good. So if we do this, with the adjusted EV spread, Vaporeon will have will invest 208 EVs into its HP, 252 EVs into its defense, and 48 EVs into its speed, whereas the Machamp will invest 208 HP EVs, 252 attack EVs, and 48 EVs into its speed. Now, to explain the results of exactly what we've done by switching up this EV spread, since, as I said before, Vaporeon falls in the base 65 speed tier, with the 48 EVs into its speed, Vaporeon can now comfortably outspeed Pokemon in the base 70 speed tier, so 1 speed tier higher if we're going in increments of 5, which will give it an advantage over Pokemon such as Bisharp and Expod that are running 0 speed if they're running max HP and max attack or special attack, Hitmontop, Hypno, Lantern, Metagross, Defensive Politoed, and Skarmory. And that is quite a lot of Pokemon that Vaporeon typically is slower than, that it will now actually be faster than if you invest those EVs into its speed stat if the opponent that you're up against is running what would be typically a standard set that isn't really running a lot of speed EVs. So this is actually a pretty significant list, and to an extent extremely important to note, because especially for the physical attackers, if you're able to burn them before they can even attack you since you're outspeeding, that just allows Vaporeon to pretty much wall them even more so than it was able to do before. And in the case of something such as Skarmory, which often uses Whirlwind on its sets, if you're running a Vaporeon with Roar, you can Roar it before it's able to Whirlwind you, and against any of the other defensive Pokemon like Lantern or Hypno, you can maybe get off a Toxic on them or get up a Wish before they're able to take you out, or a number of other different things. So there are a ton of options that have now opened up just because we decided to invest in speed on our Vaporeon. Now for Machamp, this is actually even more significant to an extent because we're using an offensive Pokemon that will now actually be able to outspeed a ton of other Pokemon and possibly even take them out very easily because we're running a lot of attack. So as I said before, Machamp is in the base 55 speed tier, so with those 48 speed EVs, Machamp can now comfortably outspeed Pokemon in the base 60 speed tier, 1 speed tier higher than it, giving it an advantage over Pokemon such as Empoleon, Jellicent, Porygon 2, Swampert, Weezing, and also a bulk up or defensive variant of Scrafty that typically does not run speed EVs. And if you look at all of these Pokemon, the main thing to point out is that a bunch of them are actually weak to fighting type attacks that would normally outspeed Machamp. So like Empoleon and Porygon 2 and Scrafty. All of them are weak to fighting, and since Machamp is normally slower than them, they can often attack you before you're able to hit them really hard. But because we're now running speed EVs on it, we can possibly just take them out in one shot before they're ever even going to attack you back. And this is also even more important, especially for Machamp, because being a dynamic punch user, this could mean that you confuse something, meaning that it will not get the chance to attack you if it hits itself in confusion, and thus you can keep attacking them because you'll be able to confuse them before they're able to even go first. And for a Pokemon like Weezing, which is going to try and burn you, getting confusion on that can give you an advantage. It might even hit itself in confusion so you don't get burned and can keep attacking. And for a Pokemon like Jellicent, now a lot of Machamps are running knockoff, so you can hit that thing extremely hard before it's able to burn you, or if it's at like a, half HP or something, you can probably just take it out. So this gives Machamp a whole slew of offensive options that it didn't have before because we decided to invest in speed. And also it is important to note that in both cases, neither of these Pokemon need to worry about speed ties with other Pokemon in their original speed tier because you are running so much more speed than a Pokemon in either the base 65 in the case of Vaporeon or 55 speed tier would. So this means that you will always outspeed those other Pokemon and thus be able to not have to worry about speed tying with them at all. And overall, I honestly cannot see a reason not to do this with all of your Pokemon. But the funny thing about this is that if everybody decides to start doing this, what's going to end up happening is that you're just going to end up with constantly changing EV spreads to try and one-up your opponent. Because say somebody was like, oh, well, everybody's running 48 now to outspeed, I'm going to run 56, so I always outspeed everybody running 48. And in my opinion, this is possibly the best thing that can happen to this game, because all that's happening is it's just creating a more deep game that is just constantly based upon trying to one-up your opponent and really trying to, figure out what exactly is the best spread to always be outspeeding things and being able to gain an advantage in battle. And in my opinion, that is what building sets for Pokemon is all about. Always trying to be creative and being one step ahead of your opponent, always changing your strategy to improve upon it and be able to beat the things that you are struggling with. And to me, that would be the best thing to ever happen to this game if everybody started doing something like that. So that is pretty much all I have for you in this first video. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments because I would love to answer them if any of this was confusing. But as always, everybody, that is it for this video. So as always, take care, goodbye, and I will see you all next time.